We're here to increase our collective understanding of how great cities are shaped. We believe everyone has a role to play in urban design. This is a space where we can learn from international examples and discuss issues relating to built form, the distinctiveness of cities, and how we feel connected to place. We can be curious and open-minded. We can all learn and grow. So, let's get to it, Geelong.
Hello and welcome everyone to the fourth webinar in this Designing Geelong series. It's a special webinar brought to you as part of Geelong Design Week. My name is Jonathan Daly. I'm the Manager of Urban Design and Heritage at the City of Greater Geelong and City Design Champion. Designing Geelong is an educational webinar series to help demystify how cities are designed. And it's brought to you by Revitalising Central Geelong, a partnership between the City of Greater Geelong and the Victorian Government, delivering a 10-year programme to realise the incredible potential of this city. Geelong is undergoing significant changes, and we want the whole community to be better able to engage in the process of shaping our city. The format of the webinar today, we've got a presentation first by a guest speaker, followed by a 35-40 minute Q&A. So please feel free to post questions in the chat during the talk. And just to remind everyone, it is an education webinar series, so we will focus on questions that help improve our understanding of urban design. And just to remind everyone, the session is being recorded. Today's topic is a special topic in the Designing Geelong webinar series called What Urban Design Can Learn from Country. To address this important topic, we have one of the leading Aboriginal architects and educators in Australia, Jefa Greenaway. Jefa is a University of Melbourne senior academic of 2 decades standing, the founding director of Greenaway Architects, and a regular design commentator on ABC Radio Melbourne. He's championed Indigenous design-led thinking for over 25 years, as a registered architect in New South Wales and Victoria, including as co-founder of Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, as the co-author of the International Indigenous Design Charter, and as regional ambassador of Oceania of Indigo, the International Indigenous Design Network. He's a founding signatory of Architects Declare Australia, an initiative foregrounding architecture's role in tackling the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. He's also the co-curator with Tristan Wong of the Australian exhibition at this year's Venice Biennale, and was recently inducted into the Design Institute of Australia's 2020 Hall of Fame. Welcome, Jefa.
Thank you. So I'll share my screen so as we can look at a brief presentation that I've put together. So thank you very much. And I've titled this conversation, What Urban Design Can Learn from Country. But importantly, the subtext here is speaking truth to architecture and urban design. And I'll take you through a series of slides as some provocations around some of the issues that exist as it relates to engaging with country within the built environment and natural environment. So importantly, it's always good to start with language. So yama or welcome. And as is protocol, we always seek to position our relationality to country. And to that end, I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which I'm gathering, those people of the Kulin Nation, particularly the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that on all the lands that we engage with, we're operating on unceded sovereign lands of Indigenous people. And so my mob is actually further north of Victoria in Walwong-Camilleri country, which is the northwest New South Wales on the Liverpool Plains. And so often it's a case in the Australian context today is that we often share a bicultural experience, and that is similarly my heritage and connection of having an Aboriginal father and a non-Indigenous mother. And importantly, this really starts to position and understand the complexities and the layers of history and memory and of identity and of connectivity and adaptation to the Australian context. And to that end, I think this quotation really captures it well for me. if nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks, and buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome? And this statement from the Indigenous Placemaking Council, I think, captures some of the sentiments of how we engage and how we start to shape and groom the landscape to suit our human occupation. And I'm particularly interested in some of the work that we do around what I call the unmapping of country. And what that really seeks to do is start to engage in a much more nuanced understanding, which often confronts some difficult truths. And so in the Australian context, there has been a degree of cultural amnesia, of the reluctance to confront difficult truths. But what we're experiencing today, and it was particularly evident and was fermented last year, is a reckoning of history. So looking at elements like the Black Lives Matter movement, which starts to challenge some of the colonial tropes, some of the complicit context of architecture as being a colonizing device in many respects, and understanding that this is not new. These are stories which have been told for many, many years. And it's also, I think, really pivotal to understand the deep history and knowledge systems and sophisticated understanding of country that has existed here for millennia. So there is, in fact, a great level of understanding around 67,000 years of wisdom and knowledge. And so everything from the sophisticated aquaculture system on the Budge Bim cultural landscape down near Portland. And this predates the pyramids, and it challenges some of the standard tropes of how we understand culture. Indigenous people were in fact the first stone engineers. They were the first bakers. They were very nuanced and sophisticated in terms of how they manipulated the landscape. And importantly too, we need to understand that there is a tendency to look at Indigenous people as set back in time. So this ability to adapt and change and evolve and move beyond the Indigenous exceptionalism, and understanding that important figures have come before, like David Uniapan, a Narrandjeri man featured on the $50 note, who was an inventor and had a series of patents, and was an industrial designer and was a knowledge keeper. And ultimately, the aspiration is to look at how we can start to normalize collective experience that engages with Indigenous design thinking. And so this provides a real opportunity. And what we're seeing, particularly in the Victorian context, is that while there is only a handful of Indigenous architects across the country and across the broader diaspora of Indigenous people, there is a change. In Victoria, we've actually legislated for treaty conversation. We've recently announced a Truth and Justice Commission. So there is a movement in the air, and it begs the question of how does the built environment disciplines need to change and adapt to meet this new reality on the horizon. And ultimately, I think we need to engage in much more sophisticated ways and start to understand that Indigenous culture is complex. And as we speak to country, often we need to understand that it very much is connected to culture, and culture is connected to knowledge. And so segmenting this idea of the relationality between knowledge systems and country is certainly something that we need to engage with. And so ultimately we want to engage deeply and move beyond the sort of kitsch representations, and understand too that there are many moments and capacities to engage, but the question is not so much why it's important, but how do we engage with it? And so importantly, going back and revealing those layers of history and memory becomes really significant, and developing tools and mechanisms to engage. And so one piece of work that I've been working on in collaboration with Deakin University in Geelong on Wadawurrung country is the International Indigenous Design Charter. And it's a best practice document to step through a series of mechanisms to pressure test one's own culturally responsive design practice. And this very much carries through in terms of how we can think about design, including urban design, landscape design, architectural design, interior design, all forms of the built environment disciplines which engage with country. And what we're also starting to see more of across the country is other mechanisms, guidelines, principles, policy documents, which start to find ways in which we can delve a little bit deeper and move beyond some of the standard low-hanging fruits and simplistic connections to the deep history and knowledge of Indigenous peoples. One such document is the draft Connecting with Country framework by the Government Architect New South Wales. And it provides, I guess, a moment of pause to understand what we mean by this notion of country. And country very much is far beyond the sort of European construct of the sort of verdant landscapes that exist beyond our cities. As it relates to Indigenous ways of knowing, often frames country as one of relationality, connecting to language, to place, to memory, to cultural knowledge. In short, we are country. We are not separate from or set apart from country. And so that's very significant as we start to frame our understandings and how we start to create mechanisms and methodologies to engage with these sensitivities and layers. And so if we look at this particular policy document that I made mention of, importantly, it starts with a series of statements of commitment. Commitment to acknowledging and respecting Indigenous peoples and their knowledge, in support of and the rights of country, looking at developing and prioritising a series of cultural protocols, which is in some respects similar to what we're doing today, which is a means for knowledge exchange, empowering Indigenous enterprise, looking at economic benefit, looking at not only the tangible but the intangible benefits, and looking at this notion of connection and identity, and particularly engagement with traditional knowledge keepers, custodians, and importantly understanding that we're not looking necessarily at the sort of stones and bones approach to culture, but looking at how it manifests in the current but also future thinking ways of the intersection with place, identity, and how we engage with Indigenous peoples, customs, and materials. But importantly too, the responsibility that we have to engage with Indigenous and non-Indigenous, of how we engage with municipalities and governments and other bodies, but also looking at reciprocal relationships which facilitate mutual benefit and enables culture and traditions to flourish into the future. And so importantly for me, what we need to do is engage in a manner which starts to push beyond cultural expression as the only way in which we engage with country. And the way in which I think about that is more than. It's more than the muralization of culture. It's more than rammed earth or organic forms as representing Indigenous culture. It's more than creation of a bush tucker or an Indigenous garden. It's more than punching out imagery on metal screens. It's more than the creation of yarning circles or gathering places or a fire pit. So what this is really telling us is it is multidimensional. It's multifaceted. It starts with country. It's about walking country. It's about sensing country. It's about imagining country. It's about shaping country. It's about caring for country. And it's about healing country. And to touch very quickly on one project example which sort of illustrates that multidimensional approach is a project that we've been working on for a number of years at the University of Melbourne on the Parkville campus. And what this project sought to do at scale is to embed reconciliation at its core. So this is a 2.5 hectare site. There are 7 architectural and landscape architectural practices coalescing to create a unified vision of this 2.5 hectare precinct. And what we did is we engaged deeply with traditional knowledge keepers, with Indigenous elders, with 4 traditional owner groups, and we mapped it against a number of different domains. And importantly, what we sought to do was to reveal those layers of history and memory through a cultural narrative. And so with the cultural imprimatur from traditional knowledge keepers, we were able to reveal a story of water that is traversed through this site for millennia. And through this conversation, we revealed that there were a number of watercourses adjacent to the site. And the way in which we sought to understand and stitch together the disparate elements of 5 transformed buildings and 2 new buildings was to create an overarching urban and landscape design strategy mapped against the reconciliation action plan of the university, and giving prominence and expression to a story of the fact that to this very day, through the stormwater system under this university campus, is an eel migration. And importantly, what we wanted to do as a way of acknowledging and paying respect to this story and validating it through the conversations of oral histories of Indigenous peoples was to daylight water as part of one of the key moves. But importantly, we didn't stop just at some of the design moves. We looked at how we start to embed cultural moments, how we embed language, how we empower Indigenous enterprise, how we look at developing art strategies, how we start to create opportunities, how we start to translate that through architecture, landscape design, urban design, wayfinding, digital strategies and the like. And so what you can see is it enables us to make the invisible visible. No longer are some of these watercourses gone silent, but now they are given a voice. And so importantly, as I see it, the time is now. The time now is to design with country, to design for country, and the design of country. And importantly, what this enables us to do is to move beyond the deficit discourse around Indigenous culture, but to celebrate culture and celebrate the cultural continuity, the resilience, the adaptation to this landscape, and understanding that we all have a contribution and role to play. And if the starting premise is that all projects that are built in the Australian context are built on Aboriginal lands, then we all have a role to play. So I'll leave that there, and thank you. Murray, go well.
Thank you very much, Jefa, for a fantastic presentation. And I'm not sure about everyone else, but I feel quite sort of humbled by that, in the sense that it really speaks to how little we know, even in the profession of the built environment and the expertise that we have. And I think even as practitioners who may be quite sensitive to this issue and issues of inclusivity, that we still really lack that knowledge to be able to authentically engage and deliver those outcomes. But this is an important step in that journey towards developing that knowledge. So we're going to open up the Q&A now. So if you haven't already done so, please post your questions in the chat function, and we will try and get to them get through as many as we can. We are moderating the discussion, and we'll focus on those questions that aim to really improve our understanding around this topic. So I might kick off, and Jefa, I think you've really touched on probably a lot of the questions that certainly that I wanted to ask you. But maybe as a starting point, if you could share with us some of your thoughts around, how can we really start authentically engaging with Aboriginal heritage and culture in the built environment?
Well, really, it starts with a conversation. And it starts with a conversation of understanding who are the voices that need to be in the room to build an affinity and a relationship and a connection to the proposition. And often what it requires is the carving out the requisite time and space to have meaningful dialogue. And ultimately, what that necessitates is enabling the necessary conversations to be had, but also to broaden the frame of reference of how we understand some of those cultural connections. And I'm often bemused by this sort of notion of heritage, because the sort of heritage guidelines, the policy parameters are quite narrow. And it begs the question in many respects, whose heritage are we protecting, and when does heritage in fact start, and what form of heritage are we seeking to acknowledge and respect? And so in many regards, we often frame it around, well, heritage starts from 1835. And that very much reinforces some of those standard sort of colonial constructs that the only verifiable and valid heritage that we should engage with is the built form heritage. And importantly, what I often seek to do is to engage in a much more multifaceted way. So starting to engage with cultural heritage, landscape heritage, intangible heritage. And so what that enables us to do is to delve deeper and to reveal some of those layers of history and memory, and start to understand that the 230 odd years of colonial history is but a blip in time compared to 67,000 years of history. So in many respects, it provides rich insights. It enables us to engage authentically with country and with place. And it also enables us to tell stories. And as I've sort of progressed through my career over the decades, is I've realized that in some respects, the role is actually as a storyteller, as a way and a mechanism to find authentic connections to place, and to reveal some of those hidden narratives, and to do it in a particular way. And it starts with the notion of respect. It starts with the capacity to facilitate deep listening. And it's by no accident that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We need to actually listen twice as much as we speak. And often when we engage with Indigenous knowledge systems and we're engaging with traditional knowledge keepers, we are often the least knowledgeable people in the room. So we're actually reliant upon those terrific insights of Indigenous knowledge to inform our thinking. And it requires a level of humility, and it certainly often involves a lot of generosity of Indigenous people to share their knowledge. And I guess creating an environment and ways of working which enable conversations to be had. But importantly, for me, it's about moving beyond, ticking a box or a sort of a compliance-driven model, which is very transactional, to a relational model. So how do we start to strengthen relationships through time and create an enduring legacy where there is in fact mutual benefit? And when we start to engage in that manner, we start to have some very fruitful conversation, which actually opens up opportunity and provides that design inspiration and becomes really compelling and enriching for the process.
When you were talking, I was thinking about, where does this start? And for certainly for practitioners, and I know our audience is wide, more than practitioners today, but you're also an educator. What can we do, or what are the issues you see in tertiary education? What do we need to unlearn, or what do we need to do differently to be able to properly listen and engage and understand?
We need to build cultural literacy. And often what's happened in the past is we've had very little exposure to any sort of cultural dimension and understanding of what I call design equity as a way of giving voice to Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous knowledge systems, and Indigenous opportunities of how it actually interfaces with design education. And so you don't know what you don't know. If you've never interfaced with Indigenous culture, how do you know a way in? Where's the starting point? And so part of my role at the University of Melbourne is actually to indigenise the curriculum and to embed Indigenous perspectives, knowledge systems and sensibilities into the way in which we frame design education from the outset. And so what that enables over time is building cultural intelligence. So as we actually are armed with the requisite skills and language and resources to engage with complexity. And so operating within these sort of socially complex environments is part of what we do as design practitioners. And so I guess some of that is sort of a process of decolonisation and of trying to focus on those elements which have actually been inhibitors and to start to broaden how we engage with design education, so as we're actually facilitating a much more sophisticated and nuanced conversation, which takes on board a number of perspectives. And ultimately what that will include is also Indigenous knowledge as part of that story. And I think one of the biggest challenges for the profession is not so much why it's important to engage with these conversations, but how. What are the steps that we need to take? What are the mechanisms to engage with this sort of inclusive design practice? And how do we actually take people on their journey when we're often confronted from some of the tensions that are embedded of time and cost and program and all these elements which often seem to be antithetical to our capacity to engage deeply. And what I often do is say, well, what is the risk appetite for it to be pear-shaped, to do it in a tokenistic way, which then results in issues downstream? You're better off carving out the necessary time early, because it actually de-risks the project downstream. And so that way you start to create a much more, receptive mechanisms to facilitate and set up the project for success. And so for me, it's really important to engage with protocols and principles and values-based approach as a way of essentially testing whether you're actually staying true to the ethos and the sort of philosophical and ethical underpinnings of how you go about your design practice, which embeds some of these considerations.
Thanks, Jefa. We'll go to the Q&A. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, and one was, I think, is very relevant to what you just spoke about. So I don't have a name, it's an anonymous attendee, but they have said most of the large infrastructure projects by the state government are a perfect example of simply ticking the box with Aboriginal engagement. How can this be elevated to going above a mural or a signage And you mentioned this in your presentation about that it's more than these things. And yeah, I'd be really interested. I think attendees would be really interested to hear, how do we move beyond this, the mere representation of Aboriginal people in the built environment?
Yeah, the sort of cultural expression as a way of badging a project, I think, is problematic because it's just too simplistic and it doesn't really get to the essence of how we embody the proposition with what I call Indigenous design thinking as part of the DNA of the proposition. So it may not be overt. It may not actually involve any design expression whatsoever. It may be about programming. It may be about embedding new relationships. It might be about restoring country or looking at increasing other propositions like re-establishing lost waterways or regenerating the biodiversity within the site, or it might be about sort of healing country. So creating ways where we start to think about sort of that sort of reparation approach. It might be about a sustainable design practice, which is in many respects a very much aligned to sort of caring for country principles. So you can see it becomes much more embodied and holistic and integrated, rather than a sort of a click on or an afterthought, or a sort of the muralization or the museumization of culture. And so when we start to broaden that frame of reference, it actually opens up the opportunities to go beyond simply, the sort of simplistic allusions to identity, which is often very simplistic and doesn't acknowledge some of the realities too. So for instance, 70% of Indigenous people are urbanized. So that's the predominant experience. And so if we're looking at large infrastructure projects where we're sort of boring through country, how do we start to speak to some of those moves? How do we acknowledge some of those interfaces? How do we start to engage in ways which actually raise the bar of how we do this? And ultimately, how do we do it in a way which sometimes might shift the dial to say, well, can we do it in a manner which talks to some of those aspirations around treaty or self-determination, or other mechanisms which actually foregrounds the unique position of Indigenous people, and how do we actually ensure that Indigenous people have a seat at the table? So this idea of voice and agency becomes really important.
You mentioned that the idea of caring for country, and that we're country. So it's partly about caring for ourselves, and it struck me that we live in a very diverse country now. Lots of different ethnocultural groups and different practices and so on. Something I've been thinking about a lot. Is this idea of caring for country maybe a common ground for all of that different diversity to find a way to come together?
Certainly, and we know we're confronting some serious challenges, from huge amounts of biodiversity loss, the impacts of climate change, the degradation of some of our intact landscapes, the health of people is diminishing with pollutants and the way in which particularly waterways have been treated, and the sort of extraction from country rather than engaging and working with and for country. And so I think importantly that idea of seeking to care for country is certainly not a selfless act, but as Arnie Dyer Wurundjeri Elder states it quite eloquently, if you care for country, it will in turn care for you. So there is a symbiotic relationship between country and health and well-being. And so by framing it in those terms, I think there's real great sort of benefit to push beyond some of the sort of ideological focus to something which is something that we can all buy into, that we can all understand, that is very legible and accessible. And it becomes, I think, a real powerful way to use it as a sort of starting premise to delve a little bit deeply and in a much more sort of nuanced way. But ultimately, the more we interact, the more we walk with country, the more that we understand the sort of the living cultural practice, and move beyond the sort of poetic conceit of the design idea as being preeminent, but what are we doing for country? And what are the impacts of our moves, and have we actually developed respectful relations with country as the sort of starting premise of how we engage with placemaking and design?
Thanks, Jefa. I've got another question from the audience. So Helen Long is asking, when you're researching the built environment from an Indigenous perspective and collating all the different aspects, how do you present all that information without overwhelming the people you're presenting to? Because a lot of it is new information. It's knowledge that people don't have.
Well, firstly, it starts with knowing your audience. Secondly, it is a process of knowledge exchange. And invariably, we are taking people on a journey. And I don't sort of shy away from the fact that some of it might be dense or heavy or engage with some difficult truths. That is our reality. And I think the more we can engage with that, the more we start to understand some of the challenges. But we often engage very deeply with traditional owner groups and develop strategies to ensure that their voices are amplified and embedded across the process. And ultimately, we seek their cultural imprimatur to proceed and to tell particular stories. So it is very much predicated on particular cultural protocols. And any research and knowledge that we develop in partnership with the traditional owners. So what we do is we seek to always facilitate opportunities to share our insights and what we manage to sort of glean through the process. And importantly, where their insights start to formulate design directions and key moves into the project, we always seek to share and to demonstrate how their valuable inputs are actually being realized, and to celebrate the journey we go on together and ensure that we start to build those relationships over time, and knowing that it is something that can't be necessarily shoehorned into these sort of false deadlines that are often sort of set in train. And often we say, well, sometimes we need to take a few steps back before we can move forward. And that is, it ebbs and flows. It's not a linear process. It is certainly something which will engage with many dimensions that are often not typically understood or presumed to be part of the journey. So we will often talk to histories. We'll often talk to self-determination. We'll often talk around how we build capacity within the community, or build resources, or to skill up communities. We'll often engage with social justice issues or other dimensions which are often not considered as being relevant to a proposition, but invariably they're woven in, sometimes overtly, sometimes much more subtly, but they, I think, become part of the sort of collective experience along the pathway towards a proposition which really seeks to engage in a manner which infuses propositions with much more meaning.
Thanks, Jefa. And we got another question, which I think connects quite well to your response. It's related to the idea that Aboriginal engagement is somehow seen as being anti-development, and a threat to the traditional way of running projects, delivering projects. I'm not entirely sure who sees it that way, but I'm interested to know, is that a sentiment that you're familiar with, and how would you respond to it?
I think that is more perception than reality. I work with traditional owner groups, recognise Aboriginal parties, land councils and the like each and every day. And often it's not so much about curtailing or preventing or holding up development necessarily. It's often about how can we engage in a way which acknowledges our unique relationship to country? How do we enable us to share in the benefits of a particular proposition? And how can we authentically engage with where we are? And what better way to do that than to engage with the deep history of a place, or to reveal those cultural narratives, or to engage with the traditional owners who are the knowledge keepers. And in the Victorian context, there are 38 distinct language groups. So knowing where your proposition is in the first instance is a great starting point. And then starting to look at how one can, look at a proposition through a number of different lenses is not an anathema necessarily to development. It's just, I think, it enriches the proposition, because often it enables a real vibrant conversation which inspires a design direction. So many times we've had conversations with Indigenous knowledge keepers, and it seeds an opportunity or plants the seed of a proposition or an idea that would never otherwise come to, because we hadn't been familiar with, or hadn't been hadn't had the opportunity to understand some of these deeper layers. And so to me, that becomes a real powerful moment in the journey of a design proposition. But importantly too, there are some sites which are very significant. So a classic example I recall was there was an important ceremonial mound and in Western Victoria, and the developer suggested to create a roundabout, of which this mound was located in the middle. And you say, well, hang on, surely there is a better way where we can both respect the Indigenous culture and the significance of this particular site, and the specificity of this sort of topographical feature as it relates to Indigenous culture, than to make it a roundabout. So you can see, but that starts with the conversation. If you weren't familiar with the significance of what that site represented for the traditional owners or the local community, then you may think that is appropriate. And I guess what we're often seeking to do is push things a bit harder, ensure that people have skin in the game and engage deeply rather than superficially. And often, and we engage with a lot of big practices and with municipal councils and state governments and different organisations, and when they learn of some of these interesting insights, they're blown away, and they go, well, how can we engage with that? How can we do justice to some of these fantastic understandings of this particular place? And that's the skill of the designer, is to I guess collate all these different inputs and insights into a cohesive design strategy, but it's done in such a way that is respectful, and that is, I think, the starting premise. Because in some respects, as practitioners, we operate within a social license, and to my way of thinking, it has certain obligations and responsibilities, and is informed by our ethical and values-based approach to design practice. And I think the more we personalize it, the more we connect to it, the more we can engage with it in a way which enables a win-win outcome.
Thanks, Jefa. And the story about the roundabout, it reminded me of an experience that I had doing my own research in Toronto in Canada, looking at a modernist public space in the center of the city called Nathan Phillips Square, which is a huge expanse of concrete. And through engagement with some representatives of First Nations people there, one of the things we were talking about, their experience of that space and public space more generally, they raised the point that the very material, the concrete, was an issue for them because it disconnected them from the earth, which is something I would never have thought about. The roundabout prompted me to think about that, because it was also in a way cutting off people from that important site. I'm interested from your experience being in cities, walking through public spaces. What are some of the aspects of the built environment that you see on a sort of day-to-day basis that you would maybe do differently, design differently?
Yeah, I often say that you can concrete over country, but country still exists. The stories, the narratives, the connections, the memory still resides on country. And if we look at even our major metropolises like Melbourne or Geelong, country is everywhere. It's not just in the sort of remote bush or sort of the outback. So these sort of tropes we need to sort of dispel in many respects. And this idea of sort of severance and disconnection from country, I think, is a really significant one. And I had a conversation recently with the Birrung Council, which is essentially the body which is the advocate for the Birrung, or the Yarra River as it's better known. And this idea of how one can look at wetting country, or how water moves across country, because often there's barriers and inhibitors which curtail those sort of natural flows or movements in a sort of often it's sort of channeled to the sort of the waterways as the only legitimate sort of relationship to sort of biodiversity corridors and the like. And so I guess in some respects my role is sometimes as a sort of provocateur and a sort of a disruptor to say, well, actually, what if you throw the rule book out and start to challenge some of those mechanisms which actually prevent the way in which things might be better done. And ultimately for me, it's really about starting to look at alternative moments where we can engage and do it in a way which starts to delve a little bit deeper, but also using the full armory of our sort of design skills to come to innovative solutions as well, because we know we're often working within a myriad of constraints. So finding your moments, and invariably not all projects have the capacity to embed an Indigenous story or opportunity. It might be done in a much more subtle way, or it may actually not be about designing anything at all. It might be designing a process. It might be designing a better connection to the community. It might be looking at other techniques where we start to work with the constraints and then turn them into opportunities. And that's why I often look at things like procurement policies, looking at other strategies which support something over time, because also sometimes there's resource constraints. So how might we phase or stage in possibilities downstream? Or how do we develop a master plan where different elements come in as resources enable? Or so starting to look at it in a much more integrated way, I think is really important, because I think sometimes we get very much caught in our silo-based approach. And developing propositions in that sort of multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary way is certainly the key. And that and ensuring that we have powerful Indigenous advocates, allies, and Indigenous people in the room is obviously a real key component in all of that.
Thanks, Jefa. We had an event on Monday night called Hidden Geelong, and it looked at one specific site in the city called Market Square. And as part of that, we looked at the European history, and we also looked at the Wadawurrung history. And the Hidden Geelong component was more about revealing the Wadawurrung history, and we've I'm learning about how many important sites there are across the central city that some we know about, some we know a lot less about, some we acknowledge in some ways, and some we haven't acknowledged at all. For example, Market Square. And where I'm coming to is around the subject of heritage. You mentioned it at the start, and heritage is always very contested. And I think with Aboriginal history, it becomes a very sort of difficult conversation. So I'm thinking in particular here about Johnston Park. Very important Waterrung site in the city, but is now has heritage protection as a sort of Victorian park. But that was an important site, a meeting site, ceremonial site, a place of resources for food and so on, and also those connections to water. How do we? This is a big question. How do we deal with this? How do we, because we're in a way how we approach from a Western perspective, heritage, we're locking in lots of aspects of the built environment. When in this case, as you pointed out, there's thousands and thousands of years of history that preceded that. I'm not asking for a solution to that particular site, but more, the bigger sort of question around how do we deal with this issue going forward in the future?
I think we need to start to challenge the blunt instrument that are the policy and heritage guidelines, because they are very limiting. I think they need to become much more fluid, and they need to be move beyond the sort of stones and bones approach to Indigenous culture. So that sort of archaeological, anthropological lens as the only valid connection to Indigenous culture. And this is where acknowledging intangible heritage becomes really important. And to that end, not only going back deep in time or even pre-settlement, the contemporary histories are also really important. So where were the places of advocacy and activation of the sort of colonial, the sort of not only things like the colonial interface and the sort of colonial wars that existed, but also some of those key moves from the sort of 1920s through to the sort of 1980s, where there was that real intensification of civil rights movements and development of Aboriginal organisations, and the sort of trailblazers and leaders who came from many of the major places that we engage with, major towns and cities and so forth. So how do we start to give voice to many of those stories and opportunities? And I think that the way we do it is really start to think of an equal balance between the tangible and the intangible, and understanding that there are certainly examples and precedences internationally that one can draw upon. Some of the movements, for instance, around looking at significant landscape features as living entities, for instance. So they have rights, and therefore you actually have to reorganize your thinking as a design practitioners to acknowledge those sort of realities. Then starts to engage in a much more sophisticated and complex ways, but that isn't necessarily a problem. It provides real clarity in terms of understanding that everything isn't about how it benefits us. It's understanding some of the I guess embedded needs and considerations of the places in which we engage with, and certainly I think heritage has value because you don't want to erase your understandings of place. And there has certainly been across time that sort of sense of erasure that has occurred of Indigenous culture, but equally we don't necessarily want to be erasing contemporary histories, and that's why these sort of ideas of Black Lives Matter is very a very challenging conversation to be had, because yes, I think there is ample reason to sort of push back on white guys on pedestals as the only expression and representation of a much more multifaceted and broad and diverse community. But equally, sometimes holding these things up as to provide a sort of a counterpoint and to have a conversation can also equally be of some benefit. So, I'm kind of torn between some of those sort of embedded sort of tensions around how we sort of engage with histories, particularly some of those difficult truths that I sort of made reference to as well. So, I think ultimately we just need to become more sophisticated in how we engage with it.
Thanks, Jefa. I think when the event that we had on Monday in Hidden Geelong, we had that beautiful recording from Karina Eccles, another Wadawurrung woman, traditional owner. We didn't have Aboriginal representation on the panel discussion that was looking at the sort of future explorations of that site going into the future, but we did point to the event today, and your contribution is sort of a follow-on from that. So I think it's really important that if you're watching, you haven't seen the Hidden Geelong recording, please do and watch this again to think about Jefa's ideas and comments that he's provided today around sort of the future shaping of cities. We've got just a few minutes left, and I did want to give you, Jefa, an opportunity just to, it was something that you wanted to share with the audience that we didn't get to through the questions, to wrap us up today.
Yeah, I think one maxim that one can always think about is not about us without us. So having that seat at the table, being an equal partner and contributor in almost this sort of notion of sort of co-design. So we're ultimately agents have agency in the process is certainly critical. The other dimension that I often like to sort of contextualize is that it's always important to build up our skills to read country. And it takes me back to an experience I had on Ewan country down near the Shoalhaven River, and we had a Ewan elder by the name of Uncle Max Dullamunham Harrison, and it was a masterclass of architects coming together, and there was 35 of us, or from 25 different countries, and he asked us, so what direction does the wind come from here on this country, as he was walking us through his country? And there was sort of a befuddled sort of expression on many people's faces, because they were saying, well, how could I possibly know? I've never been to Australia, or I haven't been to this part of Australia, or I couldn't possibly know that. And he just very nonchalantly sort of pointed to the eucalypts, and he said, well, you can see this beautiful eucalypt, and you've got this gnarly textural quality of the bark of this majestic eucalypt. But if you turn around a little bit around to the other side of the tree, you can see it's very smooth. And it's obviously the direction of the wind is on that side, because the wind is sort of constantly hitting that side of the tree. So it is a skill that we invariably have and have had for millennia. We've kind of lost our connection to the ability to actually read country. And the best way to read country is to walk country. Mm. And walking country can be as simple as knowing your neighbourhood. Familiarise yourself with your local park, to connect to where you are, to know which country you're on. And so you can see, then you start to become much more invested in an understanding of what country means. And then when you start to provide that overlay of some of the depth of meaning of country, and we know, particularly in the sort of post-COVID environment, how attached we became to the sort of the lungs of the city, to the parklands, to the things which sort of knit our cities together. That is pivotal. And so in many respects, we all have the opportunity to very much connect to country. And I think that is really significant in terms of how we start to frame our thinking, and not necessarily try and sort of segment to say, well, this notion of country is sort of that sort of otherization. It is of something that we don't know and we can't possibly know, but it's something we can actually in different ways also connect with.
Jefa, thank you very much. It was absolutely fantastic, and a beautiful way to end it with a very simple action that we can all take and on the start of this this journey. We've had a couple of requests for the link to the Hidden Geelong webinar. We will make sure that that's sent to everyone that joined in today. Thank you all for joining us. We have a quick poll for you to complete by today's webinar, which should come up in the chat. Yeah, take care, everyone. We hope to see you all next month, the next webinar. Thank you again, Jefa. Thank you very much for your time and contribution today.